Guys, good morning. All right, let's start with the session. Okay, so we will be starting a new topic called trigger handler factory or trigger handlers in short. Now, what does it means by a trigger handler factory and why we require this? So let's first of all understand that, and then we're going to see what actually it means by creating a handler for a trigger. Okay, see, we have studied about deployments, isn't it? We have studied about deployments. We completed that part. And during that discussion, I have told you one thing that if you are migrating, first of all, if you are migrating a particular module, that could be a code could be a class or trigger or something else. Let's say if you are migrating your changes from one sandbox, maybe like sandbox one to sandbox two, right? To sandbox two. In that case, although you won't require a code coverage, in that case, you won't require a code coverage. If you are migrating, if you are transferring, if you are deploying a trigger, or else if a class, that could be a general class, what you have created, or else it could be a batch class or something else, whatever. So at that time, it does not require any code coverage when we are migrating changes from one sandbox to another sandbox. But particularly if you are migrating your changes from sandbox to production, if you are migrating your changes from sandbox to production, right? If you are migrating your changes from the sandbox to production, so that time, your code must have a proper code coverage. Your code must have a proper code coverage that time. Now, what does it mean? What does it mean? So it means if we are migrating, let's say a normal class, an Apex class, if we are migrating an Apex class, if we are deploying an Apex class, right? If we are deploying an Apex class, so every Apex class, when we say Apex class, it means all of them. See, when we say the Apex class, it means all of them. Whether your class is a general class, whether your class is a batch class, whether your class is a schedulable class, all right, whether your class in fact is an API, application program interfaces, we are going to learn this in the integration. So we're going to see how during the integration, after this development is over, the next topic, the next module, not topic, the next module which I'm going to start would be integration. So during the integration, we're going to see what does it means by API classes, application program interfaces, and they are also called as web services. So when we say an Apex class, it means everything. So if a class is a normal class, if a class is a batch class, if a class is a schedulable class, if a class is a web service, an API class, if you are migrating a class from sandbox to production particularly, it must at least have 75% of code coverage. If you are migrating a class from sandbox to production, I'm not saying about one sandbox to another sandbox, because during that time, we don't require to have a code coverage. Although, if you remember this or not, when we were discussing this, I have told you one real-time thing that even though if we migrate the changes from sandbox to sandbox, we used to maintain the code coverage. This is one of a best practice. This is one of the good practice. And this is the common sense. Even though if you are moving one module from sandbox to another sandbox, that time, although Salesforce have not imposed any rule on you to have the code coverage. But we, somehow we also understand this, that down the time, we are going to require a code coverage, because maybe presently we are migrating this to sandbox, but somewhere in the time, this module which we have created is going to be get deployed on production. That time it's going to require the code coverage. So we as a developer take this as a genuine responsibility of ourselves. We feel that this is our responsibility. This is our moral responsibility, that if we are developing something, if you are creating a class, and if you are migrating that class, if you are deploying that class, if you are moving that class, even though if you are moving it to sandbox, we move it along with the proper code coverage. Although between sandbox to sandbox, it's not required. Code coverages are required when actually you are moving something from sandbox to the production environment. At that time, if it's a class, it must have at least 75% of code coverage. And if it's a trigger, it must at least have 1% of code coverage. So if it is a trigger, it must have at least 1% of code coverage. Without code coverage, we cannot deploy. Without code coverage, we cannot deploy classes or triggers from sandbox to production. Without code coverage, we cannot deploy. So see, and we would be going to learn this in the upcoming topic called as test classes. Test classes, right? Immediately after this, when this trigger handler factory is over, if this gets over by today, it's a good thing. Otherwise, one more session is going to require. But this is a small topic. I feel that most probably it's going to be get completed today, if not by tomorrow. Anyhow, so from day after tomorrow, we'll definitely going to start with the next topic called as test classes. And during that test classes, we will going to understand how to create that test classes, which would indicate how much code coverage presently is there and how much it is required. But at least you should know what is the minimum governor limit. What is the minimum limit of that you should know. And we always try to make it more than that. So at least your classes, every class should at least have 75%. Although we try to get 80%, 90%, 100%. If it's possible, try to get 100% code coverage. In some of the cases, it's possible. In most of the cases, it is not. But at least, the minimum threshold limit is 75%. So we should always try to get something beyond that. And for a trigger, if you have created a trigger and you wanted to deploy that trigger, it should minimum have 1% of code coverage. Now, that was first part of our discussion. I hope you guys have understood that. Do anyone have any confusion in this? You can ask right now. Right now, you can unmute yourself and ask me if you have not understood what I have said so far. That if you are deploying a trigger, if you are deploying something although from one sandbox to another sandbox, that time you don't require. That time officially you don't require. There's no governor limit from the Salesforce when we are deploying a change from one sandbox to another sandbox. But being a developer, it's our moral responsibility that even if it is not required, we maintain code coverage that time as well. Code coverages, although are required when you are migrating finally from sandbox to production. And in that case, if you are deploying a trigger, it should have at least 1% of code coverage, whereas every class, whether that class is a normal class, batch class, API, web service, or it could be anything. If it's a class, schedulable class, if it's a class of any type, it must at least have 75% of code coverage. And we always try to achieve more than that. Anyways, so that was first part of discussion. Now let's quickly understand the second part of it. So particularly when we wanted a trigger to have a code coverage, particularly if we have created a trigger, you have created a lot of them for the practice. I'll try to give you more scenarios if you guys are interested. I'm not sure because nobody is posting your batch, right? I'm little disappointed with you guys. Don't mind, but this is fact. I'm little disappointed with you guys because nobody is posting the homeworks in your WhatsApp group. You got a lot of time because almost in every week, you get at least 1 or 2 holidays. No one is trying. No one is giving the responses to all those assignments and homeworks which I have given. So if you guys are interested, I'm going to give you more scenarios of trigger. Otherwise, let's end the topic over here. So when we wanted to deploy a trigger, we must have at least 1% of code coverage, right? That code coverage, to obtain that code coverage, to achieve that code coverage, we must write something called as trigger handler. Trigger handler in general, otherwise full name is trigger handler factory. What is a trigger handler factory? What is a trigger handler? Trigger handler is a class. It is a class. It is a class. In short, let me try to make it simple to understand. In one sentence, in just one sentence, let's end up the story. Let's try to end up the story with one sentence only. Test class can be written, can only be written. Test classes can only be written for a class. Test classes can only be written for a class. Now, what does it mean? If you have written a class, APIs, batch class, normal class, schedulable class, all right? So test classes, you can write it directly. But if you have written a trigger, what about that? Trigger is not a class, because class has a different format in FX programming. Trigger have a different format. And we have seen that, right? We know. You have very easily distinguished, you have very easily identified that writing a trigger, the format of writing a trigger is very much different, is absolutely different the way classes are written in the FX program. Because the syntax normally for a class is access specifier, maybe public, private, or global, not protected, because classes are never protected. Then there is a keyword called as class, like public class, name of the class. All right. And then opening and closing curly brackets. Whereas triggers are written like trigger, name of the trigger, on, name of the object, and after that, events before or after. And then along with like what kind of DML after insert, before insert, sometimes. So yes, of course, they are completely different. So if you are writing a class, we can directly write down a test class for that, right? Because test classes are only written for class. What about trigger? What about trigger? So that's the reason, that's the reason we write down a class. We write down a class for trigger. We write down a class for trigger. We write down a class for trigger. We write down a class for trigger, and this class, which we have written for a trigger is called as trigger handler factory. This class, which we have written for a trigger, is called as trigger handler factory. And then now for this class, you will going to write down the test class. So this way, indirectly. So how it is like the flow look likes to be like this. You have written a trigger, then you return a test. You return a handler factory for that. Okay, you would return something called as trigger handler or trigger handler factory. And for that trigger, you are going to write a test class. You are going to write a test class for this class, because trigger handler ultimately is what? It's a class. And by the way, with writing this class, we'll try to achieve at least 1% of code coverage. So I wanted to deploy this trigger. This trigger cannot be deployed unless and until I have a proper code coverage for that. Code coverage test classes cannot be written directly for triggers. Remember this. You cannot write down test class directly on trigger. Test classes are always created for the classes. Test classes are always created for the classes. So that is the reason for this trigger, I'm going to write a class. I'm going to write a class. For this trigger, I'm going to write a class, and that class is called as trigger handler factory or simple trigger handler. Now, for this class, you will write down test class, which would, and by writing that test class, we would try to achieve at least 1% of code coverage for that trigger. So this is the biggest reason. This is the biggest reason why to write down a trigger handler. And listen this very carefully and mind my words. This is a very common interview question, by the way. Every one of you, listen this. Everybody, concentrate. This is a very common interview question. First of all, what is a trigger handler or a trigger handler factory or a trigger handler class? First thing, why it is required? Why it is required? And there's one more question just after this. So what is a trigger handler factory? You will have to start this when this is a question. When this is a question, what is a trigger handler factory? For example, if they have asked you this, what is a trigger handler? You should ideally, if you ask me this question, my answer rather would start from the story of deployments. I'm not going to straightly come into this. If this question is asked to me in the interview, what is a trigger handler factory? And my answer rather would start from the story of deployment. I will say, see, let's try to understand this. So if you are deploying a trigger, it should at least have 1% of code coverage. That to be if you are deploying it from sandbox to production, because ultimately if you are deploying something from one sandbox to another sandbox, although Salesforce does not have imposed any rule that time, it is recommended to have the code coverage, but otherwise you can ignore at that time. But basically, finally, when you are trying to deploy a trigger from sandbox to production, it must at least have 1% of code coverage. Now, to achieve this code coverage, we must have written a test class. And that test class, the test classes can only be written on the classes. That's why to achieve the code coverage, for a trigger, whenever the test coverage is required for a trigger, see, we must have written the test class or test handler class or test handler factory or test handler, trigger handler, what I'm saying for that. So this is why it is required. The second question, can we have a trigger? Can we have a test coverage to a trigger without writing trigger handler? Answer is no, no, no. If someone is asking you this question that can we have a test class written for a trigger which does not have a trigger handler, क्या आप देखो मैंने अभी पूरी स्टेप बताई, आपने पहले लिखा ट्रिगर, ठीक है, आपको उसे डिप्लॉय करना है प्रोडक्शन पे, प्रोडक्शन तक जाने के लिए उसके पास में एटलीस्ट 1% का कोड कवरेज चाहिए. ये कोड कवरेज कौन साबित करके देगा? विच इज दैट अथॉरिटी विच इज गोइंग टू से यस दिस ट्रिगर इज क्वालिफाइड ट्रिगर, इट्स एन एजुकेटेड ट्रिगर, इट्स अ प्रॉपर कोड कवरेज ट्रिगर. कौन बताएगा प्रोडक्शन को? ये तो ये बताएगी टेस्ट क्लास. ये क्वालिफाई, ये डिग्री देने वाला काम जो है वो टेस्ट क्लास का है. तो क्या आप ट्रिगर की टेस्ट क्लास डायरेक्ट लिख सकते हैं? नहीं, नहीं. क्लास के लिए अगर आपने एक जनरल क्लास बनाई होती तो आप बिल्कुल डायरेक्ट उसके लिए टेस्ट क्लास लिख सकते थे. 75% मिनिमम कोड कवरेज चाहिए उसके लिए, लेकिन ट्रिगर के लिए नहीं कर सकते. तो जब ट्रिगर के लिए नहीं कर सकते तो फिर क्या करना चाहिए? तो आपको हमेशा याद रखो कि ये बीच की स्टेप आप इग्नोर नहीं कर सकते. आपको यहाँ पे आपको इसके लिए इसका ट्रिगर हैंडलर क्लास लिखना पड़ेगा, ट्रिगर हैंडलर क्लास, और उसका फिर आप टेस्ट क्लास लिखेंगे ताकि आपको उसका कोड कवरेज आप साबित करके दे पाओ. तो ये एक दो क्वेश्चंस में इस तरह से घुमाया जाता है. I hope this is clear to everyone, right? So please don't make yourself confused with this. This is absolutely defined steps which cannot be altered, which cannot be changed in any way. All right. So this is the reason, this is the most important. So अब इसके बाद याद रखो, every trigger which you would be creating, you also have to write, a test class for that trigger. All right, let's understand. So what is a trigger? What is a trigger handler factory? Let me try to take certain example here. I'll just take something from here. Let's go to developer console and let's see how many triggers we have created. I'll just pick up quickly one of them and I'll show you like how to write down a trigger. That's a trigger handler factory. So this is a trigger which we have created in the past. We created this on the account object. Let's understand what this trigger is doing. What this trigger is doing. Okay, so before insert, before update, and before delete. It's a before trigger, first of all. It's a before trigger, and it is getting applied on these three events. And if it is before insert and update, it is making all these fields as a mandatory field. Then for the delete part, or if you're trying to delete, there are two things. If your account is an active account, it is stopping you from at deletion. And while deletion also, it is doing something that it is breaking that chain. If that account is getting deleted, so the associated contacts, they are not getting deleted. It is breaking that relationship over here. So this is a trigger. All right. So let me do one thing. Now let me create a handler class for this. All right. Let me create a handler class. So I'm creating a class, Apex class. Usually the name of the handler classes are like this. You can make it different, but it is a usual pattern that everyone usually follow the same pattern of naming, right? What is that? Because this is a specialized class, right? This is a handler class. For which trigger? It's a handler class for a trigger called as account trigger, right? It is a handler class which I would be creating for this trigger. So usually what is, how you going to name for that? How you are going to give the name for that? So what we usually do is like, we give a name. First of all, we take something like this, account trigger handler, right? If you want, you can put up an underscore over here. That is also okay. You can make it in a continuity. That's up to you how you wanted to see that. But usually this is what the naming convention we follow. All right. This is what a naming convention we usually follow. So I'm creating a class with the name account trigger. This way, anyone can understand this is not a normal class. Rather, this class is being created. This class is created for account trigger. Right. So this becomes account trigger handler. All right. Now let's understand what I'm going to do this. All right. So how many business logics are over there? Here, this is one logic. This is my second logic. Actually, there are three things which is happening over here, right? You can understand. There are three things which are happening with this. This part is making some of the fields as mandated. That is the first thing. This business logic, rather, I should say, this business logic is the first business logic, which is making few of the fields of account as mandatory field. All right. That is the first thing what this trigger is doing. Second, there is a second business logic over here, and this business logic is looking into that if someone is trying to delete an active account record. So it is putting up a validation over there and it is stopping. It is putting up this error message and it is stopping the user that you cannot delete this account. Right. That is the second thing what is happening around over here. And there is a third business logic. There's again a third business logic. This one, there is a third business logic, which is before deleting an account record, it is breaking the relationship of that account with all those related contacts. And so what is happening out of this context? So if that account is deleted, the related contacts, they would not be deleted. Because by default, this is a default behavior of Salesforce that If you delete an account, it would delete all the related contacts as well. So there are three things which are happening over here. There are three things which are happening over here. This trigger is performing three different operations. This trigger is performing three different operations. So listen to this. For every operation, or rather for every event what is happening over here, we would going to create a method. You're going to understand. I'm just elaborating this very slowly, so don't worry. The first business logic is working for before insert an update. Before insert an update. Before insert an update, we are doing something. And then for before delete, we are doing something else. Although we are doing two things over there, okay, it's okay, no problem. But if both of them, this business logic as well as this business logic, they are inside in this block only. Yeah, they are inside in this block only. All right, there are three things which is happening, but I would say that this is one block of before delete, and another block is before insert and update. See, I am creating a method. I am creating a method, public static void. Public static void. And you can give any name. You can give any name to the method. Usually they are named like this. Handle. What? Handle before insert update. Or if you want, you can write before insert and update. Before insert and update. This is my first method. What I mean, looking into this, I came to know, अच्छा, before insert or update, में जो कुछ भी हो रहा है, it's happening all around over here only. Within this block, whatever has been, whatever is happening, I'm not interested. Even though if I don't understand this whole thing, right? It is not needed that you should always go and see what the trigger is doing, what the trigger. ये तो हमने बनाया इसलिए हमको पता है. Otherwise, मैं इसका अगर handler लिख रहा हूँ, तो even I don't have to look into what this trigger is doing. More importantly, I just have to look into this. Acha, this is a block. This is a block. This is another block. There are only two blocks. Okay. There are only two blocks. The first block is getting called. When it is a before insert and update. Okay. The another block is getting called when it is before delete. Okay. So according to that, one second, I would be creating two separate methods, right? And it's not identifying and is not recognized. So I would do one thing. Maybe that would work. Let me try to save this. Yeah. So and is a reserved keyword, by the way. That symbol and is a reserved keyword. So public static void handle before delete, right? This is the second method which I'm creating inside in this class, the second method. So I just have created two methods, nothing else, guys. I just have created two methods. Based on what I have seen over here, I found that this trigger has two blocks. The first block is getting called, when it's a before insert and update operation. So accordingly, I have created a method where name looks to be very similar. Before handle, before insert and update. Next, what I have identified is there is another block as well, which is getting called before delete. So I created one more method for this, and the name I have given is handle before delete. All right, we are going very slowly, step by step. Even after that, if someone of you would not understand, please raise your hand. You are free to ask me question at any point of time, right? So don't feel any hesitations around. Okay, now see what I'm going to do. How trigger handlers are created. People have taught this very difficult way, in a very difficult. I have interacted with a lot of students, lot of candidates, those who take training from some other places. They, a lot of people come with here in my office, here in my home, and when they talk about their trainings, they used to say that there are a few of the things they found it's very difficult. I asked them, what is that? What is that? What do you feel is a very difficult thing to understand in Apex programming? Some of them say that it's a batch program. It's a batch program. It's really difficult to understand. Some of them say it's a test class. Some of them say it's writing a handler class for a trigger. Writing a handler class for a trigger. So I have interacted with a lot of students, and they usually say that they are having difficulties with these topics. So it's always depend. It's not their fault. Very obviously, I don't blame, because they does not have anything with this. Yeah, it's a fault of the person who has given the training. Maybe he taught them in a way that this seems to be a very difficult topic for them. That's the reason. All right, that's the reason. Although these are very easy to understand, especially this topic, especially writing and handler class is absolutely easy to understand. It's very easy to understand. And that is why I'm going in that way, slowly, slowly, and slowly. See what I'm going to do after this. What I am going to do after this. What I'm going to do after this. If the trigger is a before trigger, which is getting applied on insert and update operation. If the trigger is a before trigger, which is getting applied on insert and update operation, this trigger, on this event, this trigger would perform all of this, See what I did. I just have cut whatever was written over there, and now I am pasting it over here. That's it. That's it. There are a few modifications which is required. Yes, of course. Let me finish this discussion first. This trigger is getting called when you are attempting to delete something. Before deleting, this logic is getting called. What is a logic? Whatever has been written from here to here. Whatever has been written from here to here is the logic, is the business logic, is the business logic of this block. Again, cutting. And I'm pasting it over here. I'm pasting it out over here. Do you find this as very difficult to understand? Now tell me. Do you find it very difficult to understand? Is this very difficult to understand? No, absolutely not. You just have required now from this on. You just have required to make a few modifications. What is that? I'm coming into that fact. I'm coming into that fact. First of all, tell me in chat whether do you understand this. What I did so far, I just have removed the logic. I just have removed the logic from trigger. I just have removed the logic, the business logic. Initially, there was a business logic over here. I have removed that. For this one as well, I have removed that, right? I have removed the business logic from here. And see, please listen this carefully, rather write it down. Write it down. Write it down. This type of trigger is called as this type of trigger. This type of trigger is called as logic-less trigger. This type of trigger is called as logic-less trigger. This type of trigger is called as logic-less trigger. Because there is no logic. There is no business logic over here. This type of trigger is called as logicless trigger. This type of trigger is called as logicless trigger. Because there is no business logic. Rather, the business logic has been migrated to a class called as handler class. The business logic is migrated to a class called as handler class. So this type of trigger which does not have, it just have the instances, it just have the events. It just have the event, although this is not completed. I'm going to complete that, but we are moving very slowly. All right. We'll try to understand every step of this. So any such kind of trigger where there is no business logic and the business logic is being shifted, the business logic is written, the business logic is shifted, written into another class. So such kind of trigger is called as logicless trigger. This type of triggers are called as logicless triggers. All right. Now let's establish a connection between these two, because right now this is an individual entity and this is an excluded one. There is no interconnection between them. I'll have to make them interly connected. How? Okay, let's come to this one. Whatever was present over here, the logic, that business logic, listen this. That business logic which was here, now that business logic is present. This is that business logic, isn't it? This is that business logic. This is that business logic. There are coming errors because of this. Will coming back. Don't worry. वहां तक आते हैं धीरे धीरे. इस ब्लॉक के अंदर यहाँ पे जो बिजनेस लॉजिक हुआ करता था, वो बिजनेस लॉजिक हम देख रहे हैं कि वो यहाँ पर है, वो ये है. और बाय द वे ये अब किसका हिस्सा है? These are present inside a method called as handle before insert update. तो मैं क्या करने वाला हूं? What I am going to do, see, you can understand. ये मेथड जितनी भी, ये भी मेथड बोलिए आप और ये भी मेथड बोलिए, ये जो मेथड्स आप देख रहे हैं इस वक्त, ये जो मेथड्स आप देख रहे हैं, ये दोनों मेथड को हमने स्टैटिक मेथड बनाया है. We made it as a static method. Now, can any one of you quickly unmute yourself and tell what is the advantage of making a method as static? Come on. Quickly, very quick. What is a benefit of making any method as a static method? There are so many of them, although, but the one which is closely known to you should be one only. Yes, so, Ruchira.
In execution, in execution window, we can directly, by writing a class name, we can directly get the function method
name. Exactly. So what Ruchira, Bhageshri, it is not getting executed automatically. Rather, what Ruchira was trying to say was absolutely right. You can call any static method directly by just putting the name of the class name dot method name. Class name dot method name. See, I can call this. I can call it from any place, not just with execute anonymous window. I can call it from any place. See. These are the two methods. What I required? I required to call this over here. Just a moment, guys. This call is important.